Nobody in Whitmore County talks about the winter of 2022 the way it actually happened. The county paper ran it as a flooding event, a natural disaster. Seasonal runoff, they said, the kind of thing that happens when you put 74 homes on a floodplain and then act surprised when the water doesn't read the zoning map. The article was 4 paragraphs. It didn't mention my name. It didn't mention Darrell Vetch. It didn't mention the drainage study that a real estate developer had submitted to the county with a 4.2-acre pond erased from the map like it had never existed. But there is a question buried under all of that, a question I've been sitting with for 2 years. And it's the reason I'm telling this story today. Can a person do something completely legal, something they have every documented right to do, and still be called wrong for doing it? I've thought about that question for a long time. I still don't have a clean answer. What I have is the record, the full record, the permits, the agreements, the emails, the court filings. 2 years of paper that tells a story the county newspaper never printed. Here's what I know for certain. They demolished $67,340 worth of my property without a lawful basis. They came to my land with a county crew, a code enforcement officer, and a skid steer loader, and they crushed everything I had prepared for winter: feed corn, livestock supplies, veterinary equipment, 3 years of my own canned goods, and left me with a debris pile and a citation notice. They did it using the signature of a county commissioner who had a financial relationship with the developer who'd built a subdivision on my downstream floodplain. They thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. By the time this story finished, 14 homes had flooded. A county commissioner had resigned under investigation. A development company faced $4.2 million in civil liability, and a homeowners association had dissolved itself rather than face what was coming. I won a settlement of $847,000, and I sold 60 acres of my grandfather's land to stay solvent long enough to collect it. Let me start at the beginning. My family has held 140 acres in the eastern part of Whitmore County since 1951. My grandfather bought it from a timber company that had stripped it bare and walked away. He replanted every inch of it over 20 years. White oak, loblolly pine, fescue pasture. He built the stock pond in 1963. A spring-fed retention pond, 4.2 surface acres, fed by a natural underground spring on the upper ridge of the property. He put in the spillway himself. Concrete footings, corrugated steel culvert, a hand-operated sluice gate that ran to Dellard Creek at the eastern boundary line. By 1970, that pond was deep enough to sustain a breeding population of base, a 60-head cattle operation, and an irrigation draw for the lower pasture that kept us through 2 serious droughts. My grandfather kept every piece of paper related to that property in a fireproof steel cabinet in the corner of the equipment shed. Building permits, surveys, correspondence with the county, and the 1987 Water Management Agreement, a recorded instrument he'd signed with the Whitmore County Water Resources Board when the county was expanding its rural drainage inventory. I'll come back to that document. Everything in this story eventually comes back to that document. I inherited the land from my mother in 2014. By that point, I was running 87 head of cattle, 2 hay meadows, and a 1,200-square-foot root cellar built into the north hillside, the kind of earthwork structure that stays between 45 and 55 degrees year-round, which matters when you're preserving food without commercial refrigeration. I had a 3-stall equipment barn my father and I framed over one summer in 2009. And in 2018, I permitted and built an auxiliary storage structure, a 36 by 48-foot pole barn set 220 feet back from the northern property line, constructed entirely for winter feed storage. Feed corn, mineral blocks, orchard grass hay, bulk livestock supplements, the things that get you through a Whitmore County January without watching animals die. Every autumn, I run what I call the winter setup. It's methodical. I start in August with the preserving, and I finish in October when the last hay bales go into storage. In October 2022, my setup looked like this. 18.4 tons of shelled feed corn in the auxiliary barn, secured in 16 1,100-pound bulk tote bags, 47 bales of orchard grass hay, 600 pounds of livestock mineral supplement, 1,100 jars of home canned vegetables, fruit preserves, and bone broth from my own cattle, 3 months of veterinary supplies, injectable antibiotics, wound care materials, 2 full calving kits, 2 diesel generators with 80 gallons of stored fuel, a complete set of spare hydraulic fittings for the baler and the post-hole digger. When I priced it out for the insurance claim later, the total came to $67,340. That was my winter. That was 3 months of independence from roads that freeze, supply chains that fail, and hardware stores that close early on Saturdays. My family had built that kind of winter for 70 years. I had built it again, the same way, because there was no reason on earth to do it differently. They destroyed it in 4 hours on October 14, 2022. To explain the October demolition, I have to go back 2 years earlier. In the spring of 2020, a company called Greystone Homes purchased the 220 acres immediately north of my property line. It had been a working cattle farm, the Hollenbeck place, that had sat listed for 3 years after the family relocated. Greystone paid $1.84 million for it. I didn't think much of it. Land sells? The county had been growing steadily since a distribution hub opened near Keswick in 2018, and rural acreage was moving faster than it had in years. What I didn't know, what none of the landowners along Dellard Creek Road knew, was that Greystone had already filed a preliminary subdivision plat for a 74-home development called Creekside Pines before they'd even closed on the purchase. The application was filed with the Whitmore County Zoning Board in December 2019. It was approved in March 2020 on a vote of 4-1. The vote was chaired by County Commissioner Darrell Vetch. Vetch had served on the Whitmore County Commission since 2011. He was known as a pro-development voice, the kind of commissioner who cut ribbons at strip mall openings and gave speeches about economic growth. What was not public knowledge in March 2020 was that Vetch held a 12% equity position in Creekside Development Partners, LLC, which was the holding entity for Greystone Homes' Whitmore County operations. That relationship would emerge later, in discovery documents, in an email produced by Greystone's own attorney. But in March 2020, it was invisible. Construction began in June 2021. By the following spring, 41 of the 74 homes had sold and been occupied. The Creekside Pines Homeowners Association was formally incorporated in February 2022, with Vetch's personal attorney filing the articles of incorporation. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I think anyone who has ever received a first HOA letter knows the feeling. That particular mixture of confusion and irritation when a piece of paper arrives that treats your own property as though it belongs to someone else's committee. Keep that feeling in mind, because the letters I received were not the ordinary kind. The first letter arrived in April 2022. It informed me that my auxiliary storage barn, permitted through the county in 2018, inspected twice, in active agricultural use, was in violation of what they called the Residential Buffer Adjacency Standard under Whitmore County Land Use Code, subsection 22B, paragraph 4. Their position was that because my property now adjoined a residential subdivision, any structure characterized as commercial storage within 400 feet of the shared boundary line required a new conditional use permit. I read it 3 times. Then I pulled my 2018 permit. It was issued under Whitmore County Agricultural Use Exemption, codified in Section 14C of the County Agricultural and Rural Land Use Code. That exemption explicitly protected working agricultural structures from residential adjacency buffer requirements, regardless of subsequent development changes on neighboring properties. My barn had been built, permitted, and approved under an exemption that the HOA's letter didn't acknowledge. I wrote back, cited the statute, attached the permit, explained the exemption. 3 more letters followed, June, August, and September, each one escalating. The September letter contained a phrase I have not forgotten. It said, verbatim, "Continued non-compliance may result in referral to the Whitmore County Code Enforcement Division for mandatory remediation at the property owner's expense." I forwarded everything to a property rights attorney named Celeste Drummond, based in Keswick. She confirmed my position. She sent a formal response. For 6 weeks, nothing arrived. I assumed the matter was resolved. I went back to preparing the winter setup. The morning of October 14th was cold and overcast. I was checking the lower fence line along the creek, about 400 yards from the auxiliary barn, when I heard diesel engines coming down the barn road. 3 vehicles. A white county code enforcement truck. A flatbed trailer with a skid steer loader chained to it. A personal pickup truck I'd never seen. The pickup belonged to the code enforcement supervisor, a man named Holt, who had been with the county for 11 years, and who, I later learned, had received a letter of commendation signed by Darrell Vetch the previous winter. Holt handed me a paper. Emergency abatement order, Whitmore County, signed by Commissioner Darrell Vetch and co-signed by the code enforcement supervisor himself. The stated basis was twofold: imminent structural danger to adjacent residential properties and unauthorized commercial storage in a designated residential buffer zone. The order invoked Whitmore County Ordinance 88-14, which grants immediate demolition authority on emergency abatement orders signed by a commissioner and a code enforcement supervisor, with a 15-business-day appeal window that opens after the fact. I told Holt the structure was 4 years old and had passed 2 county inspections. I told him I had the Section 14C agricultural exemption on file. I told him there was no engineer's structural assessment attached to the order, which was required under Ordinance 12-7 before an imminent danger designation could be issued. He said he had his orders. What happened next is the part I still struggled to get through cleanly, because it wasn't just lumber and steel they were destroying. It was the thing my family does every year. It was the thing I had spent 2 months building. 1,100 jars, 16 tote bags of corn, the generators, the vet supplies I wouldn't be able to replace until spring. They didn't empty the barn first. The supervisor cited operational efficiency. The loader put its bucket through the north wall at 9:47 a.m. I called Celeste from the driveway at 9:49. She filed an emergency injunction at 2:17 p.m. The judge didn't grant the hearing until 5:06 p.m. The barn was gone by then, and a county dump truck was making its second trip down the road with what used to be my winter. I sat in my truck that night, looking at the concrete pad where the barn had been, and I thought about the fireproof cabinet in the equipment shed. I thought about the 1987 agreement. I thought about the creek. And I thought, I wonder how carefully Greystone Homes read the hydrology of this land before they built 74 houses downstream of my pond. The following week, I drove to the Whitmore County Clerk's office and filed a public records request for the complete Creekside Pines subdivision permit application, all supporting documents, all engineering studies. The full package was 340 pages. I sat in the county records room for 2 days reading it. What I found there changed everything. The hydrology and drainage study submitted by Greystone Homes civil engineering firm, dated November 2019, described Dellard Creek as a low-volume seasonal watercourse with an estimated peak design flow of 180 cubic feet per second during a modeled 100-year storm event. The Creekside Pines stormwater system, its retention basins, drainage swales, and outlet structures, was designed entirely around that number. Every pipe diameter, every swale grade, and every culvert spec was calibrated to handle 180 cubic feet per second and nothing more. The study made no mention of my pond. Not in the hydrology section, not in the watershed analysis, not in the upstream conditions inventory. I checked every page. On page 47, there was a GIS parcel map showing the upstream watershed. The pond had been removed, not obscured, not mislabeled, removed. The topography showed the ridge, the spring drainage line, the Dellard Creek channel. But where 4.2 acres of open water had sat since 1963, there was nothing. Just contour lines running clean, as though the pond had never been there. My pond holds approximately 8.2 acre-feet of water at capacity. That's just under 2.67 million gallons. At a controlled release through the spillway gate, the outlet delivers water into Dellard Creek at a rate that scales with gate opening. At 70% gate, based on my own measurements and my grandfather's original construction notes, the outlet runs at approximately 290 to 320 cubic feet per second. The downstream system had been designed to handle 180. The second document I found was the FEMA flood insurance rate map for eastern Whitmore County, Panel 18C, revised 2016. Lots 1 through 31 of Creekside Pines, the properties along Creekwood Way and the Birchwood Court cul-de-sac, the low-lying eastern section of the development closest to Dellard Creek, sat inside FEMA Zone AE, a designated 100-year floodplain. Properties in Zone AE cannot receive residential building permits under standard county procedures without either a letter of map amendment from FEMA, documenting engineered fill or elevation compliance, or a FEMA-approved floodplain development permit under 44 CFR Part 60. I searched the county permit records for any FEMA letter of map amendment associated with Creekside Pines. There wasn't one. The third thing I found was a copy of my grandfather's 1987 water management agreement with the Whitmore County Water Resources Board. Section 4, Paragraph C. The property owner retains the right to manage controlled releases from the retention structure for agricultural drainage and livestock management purposes, provided that the County Water Resources Board receives written notice no fewer than 48 hours in advance of any release exceeding 50% of spillway capacity. The agreement was a recorded instrument, meaning it had been filed with the county clerk and ran with the land deed. It was binding on all subsequent owners of my property. It had never been amended, never been superseded, never been referenced in any subsequent county ordinance. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly in your own mind before I go further. You've had your winter preparation demolished without lawful basis. You've found documented fraud in a permit application that allowed 74 homes to be built downstream of your pond. You hold a legal agreement that gives you the documented right to release water from that pond into the creek. What do you do with that? And when you answer, I want you to also think about the 14 families who would eventually come home to flooded floors, because that's the part of this question that doesn't resolve cleanly. Keep that in mind. I drove to Celeste Drummond's office the same afternoon. I spread everything on her conference table. She read it all without speaking. Then she said, "Come back tomorrow. I need to verify the water management agreement against current county code, and I want a hydrological engineer's opinion before we discuss options. Celeste's review took 3 days. When she called me back in, she laid out 4 things. First, the emergency abatement order that destroyed my barn was procedurally defective. The citing of imminent structural danger under Ordinance 88-14 required a licensed structural engineer's written assessment, per Ordinance 12-7, Section 3. No such assessment had been filed. The order had been issued without it. The Section 14C agricultural exemption I held should have insulated the structure from any residential buffer complaint, and the omission of that exemption from the order's legal basis was, at minimum, gross negligence, and potentially a deliberate misrepresentation of applicable law. Second, the Greystone Homes hydrology study represented a material omission of a known upstream water feature in a permit application. My pond had been visible on county GIS records continuously since at least 1974. A civil engineering firm that failed to identify it had either not conducted a competent upstream analysis, which is professional negligence, or had identified it and chosen to omit it, which is something else entirely. Third, the FEMA zone. AE issue created significant independent liability for Greystone Homes and potentially for the county officials who approved the permits without requiring a letter of map amendment. Fourth, and this is the part I want you to understand clearly, the 1987 Water Management Agreement was enforceable. Celeste had it verified against the current County Recorded Instruments Index. It was in full legal effect. My right to execute a controlled spillway release for agricultural purposes, with 48 hours written notice to the Water Resources Board, was documented, recorded, and legally protected. The agreement imposed no limit on the volume of water released beyond the 50% gate opening threshold. A full controlled release, or any release between 50% and 100%, was within the explicit scope of the agreement. There was no county ordinance that superseded it. There was no HOA rule that reached my property. There was no permit requirement. It was my water, my structure, and my recorded agreement with the county. Celeste also noted something practical. My lower pasture, the 22-acre field east of where the auxiliary barn had stood, was sitting in standing water after 3 weeks of heavy autumn rainfall. The pond was at 97% capacity. The spring feed was still running. The cattle had been pushed to the upper field. The agricultural need for drainage was real, documented, and verifiable. On November 18, 2022, Celeste filed formal written notice with the Whitmore County Water Resources Board, as required by Section 4, Paragraph C of the 1987 agreement. The notice stated my intent to execute a controlled spillway release for agricultural drainage purposes, opening the gate to 70% of spillway capacity, beginning at 8 a.m. on November 20th. The county stamped the filing at 3:44 p.m. on November 18th. The obligation was met. It was a gray, still morning. Cold, but not freezing, the kind of November morning in Whitmore County, where the air smells like wood smoke and wet leaves, and everything feels very quiet. The pond was glassy and dark, and the water was pushing against the lip of the overflow weir at the east end. The sluice gate on my spillway is a manually operated slide gate, 18 inches wide by 24 inches tall, controlled by a hand wheel and a threaded steel screw mechanism. My grandfather machined the screw housing himself. I've greased and maintained that mechanism for 10 years. Opening the gate to 70% takes approximately 4 full turns of the wheel, and you feel the water take it. A slight vibration in the metal, a low sound like a breath being released. I turned the wheel, the water came. Controlled spillway releases don't look dramatic. That's the thing people imagine incorrectly when they hear the words. It's not a wall, it's not a surge. It's a steady, deliberate flow, 3 feet across at the channel mouth, moving at roughly a walking pace, cutting down the Dellard Creek channel toward the east. Clear water over smooth stone, the way it had moved in every wet autumn since 1963. The difference was downstream. At the time of the release, Dellard Creek flowed for 1.1 miles from my spillway outlet before reaching the Creekside Pines drainage swale network. A hydrological engineer named Dr. Patricia Wren, retained by Celeste 7 months later for the litigation, calculated the release flow at the outlet at between 295 and 318 cubic feet per second. The Creekside Pines stormwater system had been designed and built to handle 180. The drainage swale overtopped at approximately 11:30 a.m. By 2 p.m., Creekwood Way had standing water. By 4:15 p.m., lots 19 through 31 on Birchwood Court, every one of them inside FEMA Zone AE, every one of them sitting in the lowest section of the Hollenbeck floodplain that Greystone Homes had graded and platted, had 2 to 4 feet of water on their first floors. 14 homes flooded. No one was injured. The water rose slowly over 6 hours in a development with functioning roads, and the 48-hour public notice gave anyone who read county filings adequate warning. None of the homeowners had any reason to read county water management filings. That is a fact that does not make me feel better. The notice was legally sufficient. It was not practically sufficient. The HOA filed suit on December 3, 2022. Negligent water release, private nuisance, intentional infliction of property damage. The complaint was 61 pages and cited $2.3 million in claimed damages. Celeste filed our counterclaim on December 14th. We named 3 defendants: Whitmore County, County Commissioner Darrell Vetch in his individual capacity, and Greystone Homes, LLC. The claims were unlawful demolition of agricultural property under the Emergency Abatement Order, violation of the Section 14C Agricultural Use Exemption, destruction of personal property totaling $67,340, and abuse of governmental authority under color of office. We also moved for declaratory judgment, confirming the full legal force of the 1987 Water Management Agreement. Discovery opened in January 2023. Celeste issued document requests to the county, Vetch personally, and Greystone Homes simultaneously. Greystone's production came back first. Among the documents produced was an internal email chain from November 2019, 3 months before the permit application was filed. In the chain, Greystone's civil engineer flagged the upstream retention pond on the Whitmore County GIS data, noting it as a potential hydrology complication requiring additional analysis. The email was sent to Greystone's project manager, and it was copied to a private email address that, when cross-referenced with county employment records, belonged to Darrell Vetch. The pond was not an oversight. It had been identified by the engineering firm. The decision to remove it from the submitted study had been made and communicated to a man who then voted to approve the permits it was removed from. Vetch resigned from the Whitmore County Commission in March 2023. His stated reason was personal health. The Whitmore County State's Attorney's Office opened a review of the permit approval process 3 weeks after his resignation. The Federal Housing Finance Agency, notified by Celeste's office of the FEMA Zone AE violations and the missing letters of map amendment, opened their own inquiry into the Creekside Pines permits in May 2023. The HOA's lawsuit against me was voluntarily dismissed in August 2023. Their legal reserves were exhausted. The board had fractured. 3 members had resigned and issued written statements dissociating themselves from the original enforcement actions against my property. Without a functioning board or an operational fund, the Creekside Pines HOA voted to dissolve in September 2023, failing to maintain the minimum membership quorum required under its own bylaws to hold a valid board election. The counterclaim settled in October 2023. Whitmore County's liability insurer and the surety bond carrier attached to Vetch's official bond paid a total of $847,000, covering the demolished property at replacement value, 3 years of agricultural loss estimates, and attorney's fees. Greystone Homes reached separate settlements with the 14 flooded homeowners totaling $4.2 million, with the fraudulent hydrology study serving as the evidentiary foundation for each claim. On paper, I won. Here is what I want to leave you with, and I'm going to say it straight. During the 14 months between the demolition and the settlement, while the legal costs were compounding and the counterclaim hadn't yet produced a single dollar of income, I ran out of options. My herd was already reduced after losing the feed corn. I brought them down to 31 head over the winter to cut feed costs. That still wasn't enough to carry the case. In April 2023, I sold the back 60 acres. My father cleared that land by hand. He took a brush hog and a chainsaw to the scrub cedar back there over 2 summers, and when I was a girl, I walked the fence line with him on autumn mornings, and he told me the names of every tree and what they were good for. There is a stand of white oaks in the southwest corner that have been growing since before my grandfather bought the property. Old trees, 6 of them, 3 feet across at the trunk, with crowns that spread 30 feet in every direction. I have photographs of those trees in every decade since 1961. I sold those 60 acres for $4,100 per acre to a man from Keswick who was polite and asked no questions. The money kept the legal case alive through spring and summer 2023. Without it, I couldn't have made it to the settlement. When the settlement came in October, I rebuilt. There's a new auxiliary barn now, larger than the demolished one, permitted under the same Section 14C exemption. My herd is back at 58 head. The root cellar is stocked, the pond is full, and the spillway gate is in perfect working order. By every measurable standard, I'm in a better position than I was before October 2022. But I drive past those 60 acres twice a week on my way to town. The white oaks are still there. They'll be standing long after everyone involved in this story has come and gone. I just don't own them anymore, and I never will again. And that is a thing you don't fully understand until it's true. I've asked myself whether I'd do it differently. Not the legal strategy, that was sound, and every step was within my rights. But there are nights when I think about the 14 families who came home to ruined floors and waterlogged furniture. They didn't fraudulently omit the pond from the hydrology study. They didn't sign the demolition order. Most of them had no idea what had been done to the permit process before they bought their homes. Some of them lost things they couldn't replace, the same as I did. That part doesn't sit clean with me. I don't expect it ever will. What I know is this. Darrell Vetch used the power of a county commissioner's office to destroy my property because I wouldn't comply with a demand that had no legal foundation. He did it because he had a financial stake in making sure Greystone's development was protected, and he thought a cattle farmer without the right connections would take the fine, lose the barn, and go quiet. He didn't know about the 1987 agreement. He didn't know what was in the public records room. He didn't know that a 340-page permit application with a fraudulent drainage study was sitting in a filing cabinet available to anyone with a records request and the patience to read all of it. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. And so, it turned out, was the engineering firm that erased my pond from a map. Water remembers where it goes. If this story made you uncomfortable, I'm glad you stayed with it. That discomfort means you're holding it the way it deserves to be held, not as a simple revenge story, but as something harder. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Not a verdict, not a score, just where you are with it. I read every one. If you're new to this channel, this is what HOA Nightmares does. We tell the stories that don't fit in a headline. Full legal detail, real financial stakes, moral weight that doesn't always resolve cleanly. Subscribe and come back next week. Not every story has an easy ending. This one didn't. The real ones rarely do.